It is the most alarming catastrophe of policy that I think I've ever seen anywhere, to allow minors to use the school as a backdoor to prescription medical treatment while being affirmed by the social and professional environment in the school into thinking that this is what they need to do to circumvent the role of the parent. As you would think that you're the primary stakeholder, but some other stakeholders know better than you.
I've got as my guest today James Lindsay, founder of New Discourses, newdiscourses.com. And as I've heard him put it before, someone who spends a great deal of his time reading Karl Marx so that you don't have to. Welcome to the Matt Lohmeier Show, James.
Hey, I'm glad to be here.
So your handle at Twitter is @conceptualjames, and I was just on your Twitter account. I'm on your Twitter account somewhat regularly, and I saw that your account shows that you've got 161,200 tweets. Is that accurate?
Probably. I don't know.
That's more than anyone.
Yeah, well...
just about anyone.
So here, let me explain this strategy, because a lot of people wonder about it. And actually, funny enough, I get a message probably on average about once every 4 days. James, you retweet too much. And so about...
From who?
From just random people who are disgruntled with how much other people's content I share. And so I decided about 1.5 years ago that maybe I was just frustrated, but that there's no way that with what's going on that I can take this on alone. And I didn't intend to or want to, but I realized in some sense that means we need to raise an army. And so I also think that Twitter is cheap. It's basically the lowest currency form of dialogue that there is. And so it doesn't mean much to me to just push the retweet button. I don't try to contour or curate my feed. I just, things that it might benefit for people to see, I share them. And so it turns out I have about 30 or 40 people who, and I say this with whatever love is due to them, are a bit obsessive in sending me, I think, everything that triggers them on the internet every single day. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these things. And I share a large number of them. My challenge is that and I haven't figured out what to do about this yet, so I still just tweet too much. But my challenge is that when I see each one of these things in individual, they make sense to share. But in aggregate, they're a disaster. And so my solution to that so far has been that I don't care about the aggregate. It's like my Twitter, in some sense, is kind of weird and disgusting to say for me, but it's like the Drudge Report of Twitter.com for the globalist nightmare or whatever. And so I retweet a lot of people because I want to elevate their voices so people are paying attention to them. I retweet a lot of things because I think that individually they're important to understand and to have a feeling and a sense of the scope of what all is happening. And largely I retweet a lot because I don't care. People will send me something and say, can you amplify this? And I know they're just using my platform. And I'm like, okay, what is it? It costs me nothing.
You're pretty good at that. Well, I got curious when I saw how many tweets you had done. And I'm not a prolific tweeter myself, Twitter user, tweeter. And, but I follow Jack Posobiec and some others who have a very large following. Elon Musk has got a tremendous following, and that's, of course, to be expected. I mean, he can tweet about the fact that he just had some chocolate milk, and, it gets tens of thousands of likes. So I went and I tried to look and see how many tweets those really popular users have put out, and they don't hold a candle to Conceptual James.
No, it's because I retweet literally, it counts your retweets. So I retweet literally virtually everything that gets put in front of me. It upsets people because I put about 5 seconds of thought into any given retweet. And so people, I often end up retweeting things that I probably shouldn't have, or have to delete something or unretweet something here and there. But I don't see Twitter as important. It's like I've actually got a scale in my brain of how serious you have to be with the thing that you publish. And the amount of seriousness that goes into publishing tweets is zero. Not 0.01 is zero. It's not a serious platform. The only cost that you incur from tweeting too much is that you bother people who follow you by tweeting too much. And that, of course, splits. There are the people who really like you, who want you to do it, and they tell me that they want me to keep tweeting an absurd amount of stuff all the time. But then, I do have real important people who follow me, and they sometimes don't appreciate how much of it there is. So
they have the right to ignore.
Yes. Twitter actually does not make it structurally easy to ignore. I have certain people who I follow and I like very much, and I consider them friends and everything else, and they put out good content, but they tend to like, retweet, and often comment on everything that I put. So I get I get 3 or 4 push notifications per tweet from certain people.
So like every minute of the day?
Yeah. Every time I look at my phone, it's like 20 notifications from a couple of different people, just like 2 of them. And my phone will only allow me to have 25 total push notifications from any given one app at a time. I don't know why. I don't know how to change that. And so I have this problem that other people, reply to me or something, and I never see it because it's just full from this small number of people who interact with everything I put. But Twitter doesn't, and I'm not complaining about that. I'm complaining about the fact that Twitter doesn't offer a structural ability to deal with that. There's no option where I can go in, say, to one of these accounts that I think over interacts with me and turn off notifications when they like my content, for example, as opposed to maybe I want to see their replies, but I don't want to see that they put a heart on it or whatever.
I was really curious to see who tweets more than you. And so I did the homework of like going through those I follow. Couldn't find anyone, as I said. So I Googled it. Have you heard of the Japanese guy whose account is Venethis, @Venethis?
I have not. Does he beat me?
He beats you by quite a bit. Just for the listener or the viewer, if you don't know how many tweets 161,000 tweets is, if you tweeted 25 times a day or retweeted every day of the year for 17 years, you will have tweeted as much as James Lindsay.
There we go.
And this guy has blown you out of the water. This is an article from March of 2016. This apparently a real person in Japan on the 10th anniversary of Twitter's founding, again, which was 2016. He had sent his 37 millionth tweet.
Wow, that's way ahead of me.
And he, you think you sometimes tweet things that maybe aren't as meaningful because you take zero stock in the importance of Twitter, but he was tweeting like sometimes tens of thousands of tweets a day to get that number, and it was apparently about just about anything. So he was just retweeting everything that came across his
I'm not going to quite do that.
Worthless, but if I didn't know you, I'd think you don't do anything besides sit at home and tweet. But I do know you, and I want to point out that James has written. Is it 2 books? I've got them both here, or have you written more that I don't know about?
Over the history of my writing.
Like books.
Oh yeah, I think we're on number published. I think there are 9.
Oh, dude. Well, how come I only know of 2 books?
Because I don't really talk about the 2 are the relevant ones to what's going on in the world, and the previous ones are completely other subjects that are not that relevant.
Well, James was a professor of mathematics at University of Tennessee. Is that right?
Correct.
And the first book I came across that he had written was while I was writing my book, Irresistible Revolution, and it was this book that I've held up on the screen, Cynical Theories. Pretty cool. Rainbow colored glasses on the cover. How activist scholarship made everything about race, gender, and identity, and why this harms everybody. You co-authored that with Helen Pluckrose. And the most recently authored book, if I'm not mistaken, which I recently got, is Race Marxism. And the subtitle is The Truth About Critical Race Theory and Praxis. And we had a conversation in, I think it was Miami, if I remember correctly, and you told me that you'll get into these grooves where you're researching, you're reading, you're writing, and you'll wake up sometimes and start researching and writing, and you'll basically look at the clock, and it's like 11 at night, and you've been doing it all morning, afternoon, and evening, and realize you hadn't eaten anything. Talk to me about the process you go through, just briefly about your, how is it that you're researching? How many hours are you reading each day or each week about Marxist ideology, postmodernism, and a number of other things we're going to talk about today? And how long is it taking you to put out these books? You apparently have more than I was aware of.
Yeah, I've actually written neither or published yet. I've written 2 more this year. So one is, I think, in the final stretch. One needs some work, but by the end of the year, there will be 2 more completed. One on the critical theory of education, and one on Marxism as a theology, as a religion.
Good.
So those are coming. A little shorter than race Marxism, about half as long in each case. But the process, it depends. I've been trying to be very diligent since the weather got nice at spending a rather significant amount of time outside every single day. And I'm trying to slow down a little bit. So I am spending at least a couple of hours outside, unless it's like terrible rain or something, every single day. But typically I'm reading anywhere between 15 and 20, 25 hours a week. If I fly, I read more because all I do on planes is read.
And you're flying a lot.
I do fly a lot. Yes, I fly a very lot. I'm probably going to have flown 200 commercial flights this year. By the end of the year, I had over 100 last year. So I fly a lot. And so I read on planes exclusively. I mean, sometimes to be more fair, I also will take what I'm reading and plan podcasts around what I'm reading, which isn't quite exclusive reading, but this is basically what I do. And so when I'm here at home, I read a little bit less, but largely I have either a word processor document open, or I have a email tab open. And I just kind of copy. I read almost everything on devices now. I sometimes read physical paper books, but I find it to be extremely inefficient because I can't copy paste out of them. And so I will copy paste paragraphs into documents and then start taking them apart and trying to understand them. And that becomes the fodder for the podcasts. That becomes the fodder for the books that I start to structure. And as they start to take on a shape, then I'll finally hit a point, and I may have said this to you when we were in Miami together, that I feel like I have to vomit out what I've thought about. And that's when the real writing process starts. And
that's an uninterrupted flow of a lot of writing.
Yes.
I mean, how much writing are we talking about? Because even writers usually just get through little segments at a time.
Anywhere between 5 and 20,000 words a day until I'm done. I wrote Race Marxism in 10 days, the first draft. It's 100,000 words. I wrote the first draft in 10 days. This book on education, I was a little bit interrupted with travel and other things, but it's 50,000 words again in like 3 weeks, something like this.
Even if you can type fast, for people that haven't written a book, well, let me put it this way. For people that have written a book, you know how phenomenally difficult it would be to even write 5,000 words a day. That's a lot of writing. So you've clearly got a unique talent or gift for both research and writing that I think is frankly quite odd.
It is odd.
Most people can't digest or regurgitate the amount. They can't digest the amount of information you're taking in first off, but then to regurgitate it in a coherent manner. And your writing is quite coherent. It's actually very good writing. And so the reason I bring this up is because I consider you an expert in this field. It's really interesting given your background in mathematics. You have a PhD in mathematics?
That's right. Yeah.
I'm guessing you weren't studying a lot of Marxism in those years that
zero. Literally zero philosophy or humanities, or other than the basic required courses, as a so-called liberal education going through my undergraduate. Zero. Everything was an undergraduate major was in physics. And so everything was physics and math courses from like third year forward. I took one semester where I took a whole bunch of business classes too, which I didn't really need to do that, but I thought it'd be interesting. So, but besides that, all it was physics and math. There was no philosophy, no humanities, I couldn't have told you who Jean-Jacques Rousseau was. I couldn't have told you, I knew who Karl Marx was, but only dimly. I'd never read a word of Karl Marx before maybe 3 years ago probably. And it's really strange because I got into this backwards. I got into this from the woke literature and started chewing my way backwards. You held up cynical theories. The way we wrote cynical theories was we started in the kind of last 5 years, 10 years maybe of woke literature, going back to maybe, I guess, 2011. And we finished it at the middle of 2019. So 8 or 9 years worth. We started there and then we worked backwards into the 60s and 70s. And then we told the story forward. And then I continued research and worked backwards further into the 50s and 60s, and then into the 20s and 30s, and then all the way back.
And then back to
Marx
mid 19th century. And
yeah.
So one of the reasons I've liked talking with you is because you're like a walking encyclopedia. And what I'm hoping to do for the listener and the viewer, I'm going to ask you a bunch of what is questions.
Okay.
What is this? What is that? Okay. And kind of put you on the spot. And then depending on the energy any one of those topics may have, we can tease it apart a little bit further and maybe get into, practically speaking, how it is you combat any one of those or all of them as a whole in the aggregate.
Okay.
If that's all right.
Yeah, I am a little encyclopedic, so.
Yeah, I think so. And it's a gift for us right now. You know, we need people who know what they're talking about to speak up so that the rest of us can learn. And in that regard, again, I'll put in another plug for New Discourses. I found that your website, newdiscourses.com, after I'd read Cynical Theories. And it wasn't, you know, it was an impressive platform then, but it's grown quite a bit. Do you know how many hours of content you've put on the New Discourses website? And then beyond that, like for those who are subs, how much additional content is there for people to dig through?
So it's difficult actually for me to guess the total number of hours, but it's a lot. There are 3 podcasts. There is about 250,000 words worth of written text on the platform that I've put together, some of which is published from other people. Probably about 3/4 of it is mine, in addition to the books that I've put together. In the terms of the podcasts, one of the 3 podcasts hit 100 episodes. That's the subscriber only podcast that I made. I made that actually not to lure people into subscribing, although if that happens, that's great. I actually felt guilty because I had people sending me money via subscription platforms like Patreon and YouTube subscribers and all this, and I wasn't doing anything special for them. So I decided to make a special podcast for them at literally the 1st of 2021. The first one was like the first week of January last year. And we just put out the 100th episode of that. And those range anywhere from 15 minutes, maybe up to about half an hour. So you can do the multiplication there. The New Discourses podcast is the kind of main one. We're in 70-something episodes of that now.
Some of those are quite lengthy.
Some of those are over 4 hours. And most of them are about 2 hours, and there are 70-something of them that I've done in the same amount of time. So turns out I don't just tweet. Then there's a third podcast that I've set up called New Discourses Bullets, only in the past maybe 4 months. I went to Oklahoma and talked with a bunch of lawmakers there, and they said that they, love to listen to the podcast, but these 1.5-hour, 2-hour podcasts are difficult for their schedules.
Right.
And if I could kind of do these kind of concise little nuggets that they could run with, and share 10 minutes, 12 minutes, 15 minutes or less, then that would be great. And so I started a new one, and I don't know how many of those were on, 18 or something like that I've put out. And the goal with those, although occasionally I go over, I think the longest ones get up close to 20 minutes. The goal is to keep them at 10 minutes plus or minus 2. So, the idea is that they're a bullet point summary. That's the pun. But also like, haha, I'm firing bullets into your ideology. But that's the idea, is that they're something bullet point type. They address one topic only. They don't necessarily go deep. The ones that have run long on that are actually ones where I read from their literature rather than just kind of giving a concise explanation, because I need people to see, for example, I have one that I did a exploration of the idea of critical thinking versus critical theory, and I just read these 3 paragraphs from this lunatic scholar who tells you very explicitly. I mean, I don't have to explain it. There's this weird show not tell thing that makes it more believable. But anyway, when you add all that up, hundreds of hours, 200-300 hours of audio content, 250,000 or more, 300,000 words of text content. And that's just been since I launched New Discourses in February 2020, right before the pandemic started. And so that plus the 3 books or 4 books I've written in the intervening time.
Now, one of the reasons I'm really interested in my viewer and listener being introduced into your work, if they're not already familiar with it, is because in addition to, say, 5-minute PragerU videos or other short clips that people find on the internet that help give them kind of an in-your-face, overly simplified explanation of some of these schools of thought or Marxist ideology, for example, or critical race theory, is that you have the platform where people can actually dive in. I mean, it's like listening to one of your podcasts is almost like reading a book. I mean, if you want to understand something about Hegel and the Hegelian dialectic, you go listen to James Lindsay's New Discourses for 3 or 4 hours, and you'll have multiple episodes where this will really get laid out for you. You'll get exposed to a bunch of literature, quotes directly from the authors, and someone that knows what they're talking about. And so if you're invested in learning more about these topics, I think you're a great resource. And so that's, with that said, I'd like to start with a pretty direct question, simple question, but talked about a lot. And sometimes the answers aren't as simple as the questions. But what is critical race theory?
Yeah, okay. So obviously that's what the point of the race Marxism book is. So I can summarize this for you in about 100,000 words.
Okay, good.
No, critical race theory is a Marxist theory of race. Now, just to be clear up front, I published Race Marxism, and this upset a lot of Marxists because that's not what Marxism is. It's an economic theory, yada, yada, yada. So I spoke with a Marxist. I mean, I know him professionally, but I like him, so I guess we're friends after a fashion. And he said, I'm going to have to take umbrage, friendly conversation at lunch. You have to take umbrage with you calling your book Race Marxism. That can't be. And I said, give me 5 minutes to explain, and I will consent to using the term pseudo-Marxism if it makes you feel better for what it is. But I think I'll convince you that what I'm going to say is correct. And in the end, he did agree, but he wanted to use pseudo-Marxism because he feels like what we concluded was that the certain racial theorists had hijacked the architecture of Marxism and applied it in the domain of race as opposed to in the domain of economics. And we agreed completely on this, that there is the same exact structure, that there's a bourgeoisie and a proletariat who are in intrinsic conflict. The bourgeoisie creates and maintains an ideology that maintains the structure of society as such to their own benefit, that they're willfully blind to, but you can awaken a racial consciousness both within members of the bourgeoisie, but especially within the racial proletariat, that can then lead to banding together in solidarity to seize the means of cultural production and overthrow the existing order for a new one. And so this is the essence of what critical race theory is. It is a method of studying the concept of race that mirrors the way that Marx studied economics. And if you want to say mirrors, if you want to say is, if you want to say has stolen, I don't care which one of those things. I don't care which one of those is accurate.
Does it really make a difference? It seems like academics. Yeah, academics pride themselves in being able to tease out the nuance, but as far as praxis goes, which is in the subtitle of your book, as far as its manifestation in modern society, it almost seems like that nuance fades into insignificance because it is an in-your-face, bullying kind of religion or ideology that is insistent. And you use the terms bourgeoisie and proletariat, and I'll just restate oppressor versus oppressed classes or groups of people that are now not an economic kind of class stratification, but a race identity group stratification.
Correct. Yeah. So there's an upper class. It assigns itself, actually, according to Marx, there's an upper class in society that assigns itself the capacity of being in the upper class. What it mostly does is it grants itself access to some special form of property that it excludes other people from. And then it weaves a story, which Marx called ideology, or a set of stories that explains why they get to be in that privileged position, whereas the oppressed are to be excluded, whether it's, it's just natural, God ordained it because of our hard work through merit, the meaning of education, or whatever else. They tell these stories that explain why they get to be privileged and other people are going to be oppressed. This is the basic structure of Marxist conflict theory or class antagonism. Within the confines, you say, so what is critical race theory? Very bluntly, it is the belief that white people created the idea of race, and in particular assigned themselves a special kind of property called whiteness that gives them certain privileges in society that come along with having white skin, and the cultural values that they associated with people who have white skin at the time, primarily in the 17th and 18th centuries. This creates, like I said, a set of privileges for people who are granted access to whiteness, whether that is Anglo-Saxons and Teutonic people originally, but then starts to add in Irish and Italian and, various other white groups that came to the United States, or European groups that came to the United States and got designated as white for political reasons, whether that includes East and sometimes South Asians now, because of different cultural values and the high level of success that they have when they come into the Western context in professional life and the way that they tend to structure their families, etc. So there's this form of property, kind of nebulous cultural property called whiteness that's associated with having white skin or doing what white people want you to do. And they grant themselves access to it. The proletariat, in this case, the excluded outsider, the oppressed class, are called people of color. And people of color becomes the color line, as W.E.B. Du Bois called it, becomes the line of stratification. And of course, that has its own further stratifications within it. Asian is here, Latino is there, Black is here, Indigenous is there. And that is kind of a complicated site of contest, but they're all supposed to be unified in solidarity against whiteness. The ideology that the white people in, say, the 1800s would have written for themselves to justify this is called white supremacy. White supremacy is this kind of mythology that white people are in some way superior and supreme, and that people of color are therefore in some way inferior and have to be excluded for their own good and the good of society, etc. And they believe that this ideology, in its essence, still exists, but it's changed form rather tremendously. You can't be quite so blunt with those, supremacist claims, but this is why they go around saying that everything is white supremacy. These are elements of white supremacy culture to be, punctual, meritocratic, loyal. They have this whole list of things, and urgency, primacy of the written word are all these elements of white supremacy culture that they've laid out. And as opposed to spoken testimony, for example, with written word, or storytelling, they want white supremacy culture values facts and evidence over storytelling and counter storytelling and narrative. This is another one of their kind of divisions. So what you have then is a racial upper class that's created a story for why it gets to be the racial upper class, a racial lower class that's excluded from those privileges. And this structures society according to something they call structural racism or systemic racism that maintains that stratification and exclusion and system of privilege. Yada, yada,
So we've
yada,
heard
yada.
that, yeah, systemic racism, structural racism. Those are terms we've heard a lot in the military in our diversity, inclusion, and equity trainings. They've added an A to that as well. It's now, I just saw a policy memorandum that said DIEA for accessibility as well. Now, and you've written about some of that in cynical theories as well. But when we hear terms like systemic racism and structural racism, do you accept that those? Well, I guess you have to understand definitions, and you've been getting at that. But do you accept those terms as they're used today as having value or meaning, or are they in some way misleading?
So that's a difficult question because they are a matter of worldview. Within the worldview that sees things phenomenologically, which is where kind of all of this Marxist thought backs up into, Hegel's 1807 work was the phenomenology of spirit. Within that worldview, it all makes sense. It's all as described. But the problem is that requires accepting a worldview, how not just society but the world itself is organized and operates. And if you don't accept that worldview, it's not even in that it doesn't exist. It doesn't even make sense. It's just not how things are. So as I don't accept a worldview, I don't accept the terms. I don't accept what it's referring to at all. While there may be something to which it points, that something is very different from how it's characterized by those terms and could be understood in vastly different ways to much more advantage. So the idea is, anytime you have a pair of so-called dialectical opposites, an upper class and a lower class, that their interaction creates a structure. And that structure is what is the organizing principle of that, whether it's society or whatever else. And it has a process of playing out that's supposed to transform the very nature of what is there. And structural racism only exists in a worldview that accepts that society is actually ordered this way, that it kind of sees things in terms of a class consciousness and a class antagonism, and that the structure is actually the result of that antagonism. If you stop thinking about groups in terms of being kind of unified classes, then the entire thing evaporates and doesn't exist. There could be institutional racism. The institution could be enacting racist policy, whether that's de facto or de jure. That's possible. There could be individual racism. But when you start talking about the idea that that the system itself is organized such that racist outcomes occur, you absolutely have to deny individuality to get to that point. And
that's a great point.
Yeah. So for me, it's to ask the question. The simple answer is, do I think that these things exist? The answer is no, but that misses all of what's important. What is important is that you should be asking me simultaneously, like, do you think that angels and demons exist? Like, if you accept certain metaphysical premises, then that is the description for whatever something is in the world. If you accept certain metaphysical premises about the dialectical nature of subjectivity and objectivity and the way that structures all things and they unfold throughout time and history, then structural racism is a phenomenon within that universe. But if you don't accept it, it doesn't exist. And people don't, I think, understand just how profoundly theological, or if you have to be careful, metaphilosophical, the whole dialectical architecture is. That it's a view of, as Paulo Freire describes it in his book, The Politics of Education, it's an entire concept of man in the world. And once you accept that as the self-evident description of the structure of reality, then it exists.
Some people may not have been educated or assimilated into that worldview that is, as you've described it, a kind of prerequisite for viewing the world that way. But over time and through kind of subversive tactics or propaganda, or because of the public education system, or because they're getting DI&E trainings in the military or in the federal agencies, they begin by and by to accept some of these lines of reasoning about race and how and it starts to become a lens through which they see everything in the world and by which they're interpreting all of the data about them in the world, even if they hadn't come from some other worldview that would have lent to the critical race, the Marxist-rooted critical race theory worldview. And so it's interesting to me that even though I agree with you, there are these entirely different worldviews kind of at odds and competing with one another. And you don't accept that worldview that is that lends itself to the structural racism term, or the systemic racism, the systemically racist society. Don't you think that there are those today that even with just a little bit of exposure over time, they fall victim to or prey to this worldview, and their worldview kind of slips away, or somehow this takes root, and somehow this does become people's prevalent way of thinking. And as I had a young black female enlisted airman come and sit down with me in my office when I was a commander, and this is the way she put it. She said, "I wasn't raised to believe this way, but And then what she said after that was, I've been attending these trainings and I've learned that I'm an outsider both in my country and in the uniform, and that we live in a systemically racist society. So how is it that, not having originally had that worldview, you go from that position to almost, in short order sometimes, over not a very long period of time, adopting the lens of racism as your lens through which you now view everything in society? It's the explanation for everything in society. Everyone about you who isn't your same race is out to get you, if you're a person of color or black. How do you get there? I mean, I'd call it subversion. Like, you don't realize that it's happening, but it happens so quickly that it's surprising to me that people don't recognize that they're being indoctrinated.
Yeah, we've actually, a group of friends of mine and worked on the Grievance Studies Affair together, and I have been we've been saying that it's like this, we were thinking it was, at the time, was the postmodern tree, but it's actually this entire dialectical worldview. It looks very much like the liberal Enlightenment tree. It's actually kind of a weird mirror image of it. And we've been using the metaphor of a tree. And what we've said is that they planted this tree right next to the liberal tree. So if you're up living in the liberal tree and you're in the branches, you might cross over into the branches of the other tree without ever having realized it. And then suddenly you're in the other tree. And their objective is, when they get enough people into their tree, they're going to cut the liberal tree down. And then they're the tree. And so that's the metaphor that we've been using. So there is this idea that it's pretty easy to slide in between these things and pick up pieces of it. Because it is easy to look, especially with a broadly modernist worldview that we've all had. Most of us don't realize it, but we've all held to some degree over the last at least 2 centuries. There is this idea that, wow, we have the power and capacity to change the world we live in, so we can transform the world that we live in. And so the idea that we can work with reality to change it, that's a modernist, liberal, enlightenment-based idea. And then that we can fundamentally transform its nature, that's the dialectical idea, are similar enough to where it's easy to cross over between them. And so you can slide into this. But there is a process. They actually call it, and they've spent a century developing it. Karl Marx did not do very much with this. He never really figured it out. But it's a process that's taken on the name conscientization. The Chinese
Say that one more time.
Conscientization. It took me a long time to practice to actually be able to say that. But
not Kant, not Immanuel Kantian. It's like conscientization.
It is the awakening of consciousness.
Okay.
So you are being conscientized. You're being made conscious.
That's not going woke, is it?
It is going woke.
Okay,
that's what it is. Going woke.
Conscientization is woke. No wonder they chose a different word.
Yeah, well, it was originally written in Portuguese, which makes it even more complicated, which is conscientização in Portuguese. But that's the idea. Marx talked about this process of humanization. The idea of his philosophy was to humanize not just yourself, but society and the world around you. So you were to make the world fit for human life. He actually says in the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts that he wrote in 1844 that the world as it is isn't fit for humans. We're too damn good for it. We have to make the world fit for us. Like we're some kind of kings or something that have to raise it up. But we're also, because we live in an alienated state, we are also not good enough for ourselves. So we have to remake ourselves. And this is where you end up, under Lenin, half a century later, getting the new Soviet man program. They're going to remake man to be suited for socialism. And that idea has never really gone away ever since, that we're going to remake man himself to be suited for the world that they want to create.
But now we want to remake him into a whole bunch of different things.
Correct. But the conscientization process is laid out. They've been developing it. I mean, it really got its first legs put under it in 1923. There's a Hungarian Marxist by the name of George Lukács, who a lot of people in the West haven't heard of, but he was a big deal. He helped lead the revolution in Hungary, the Soviet Revolution in 1919, that only lasted a few months. He was appointed, Bela Kun was in charge of that. He was appointed the Deputy Commissar of Education under Bela Kun. He, for people who know these things, rather famously adopted a rampant sexual education program in the schools as...
Sounds familiar?
Yes, because he understood that if you sexualize children, you sever the ties to family, you sever the ties to their own stability, you sever the ties to religion, and therefore you can transform a culture very, very quickly.
So what you're saying is the tactics have been in place for a very long time. Same old playbook?
19 is when so over 100 years now, just over 100. And so, but he wrote a book, and after this all collapsed, he went back to think about why is this all falling apart. He was one of the fathers of what's called cultural Marxism. And he wrote a book in 1923 called History and Class Consciousness. And the middle part of that book, which, by the way, for Marxist books, it's a hard read. They're all hard, but it's an elegant read. It's actually somewhat pleasant to read, very difficult. But he explains that what Marx had wrong, or one of the things Marx had wrong, is that awakening to class consciousness is a process. You have to look at it as in terms of, he calls it a gradated program. There's steps to it, right? It's so you introduce to people first that, hey, look, we actually do have class society, and that would be almost a class awareness. But the way that class society works is intrinsically dehumanizing of the people that are in the lower class. And then you start to get them to see, but this isn't, society isn't us and them. It's us and them as a cohesive whole. It's a dynamic. You can't be marginalized unless there's a marginalizer. Marginalization is a process that takes place in a bigger whole. And so he's moving you through these steps of getting you to see the world from a Marxist consciousness. After that, you have to get these people to understand, look, if you're in the upper class, you have the ability to move history around just by virtue of being in the upper class. That's what it really means to be there. But if you're in the lower class, you have to band together as a class. You have to adopt a class consciousness. You have to be aware that your class as a unit is a historical object that can change the course of history if you band together and work together. Because one of the things they were fighting against in the 1920s after World War I, two big things kind of happened. One was that they had predicted before the war that the workers' parties would start to unify internationally, and this huge international workers' party would kind of galvanize, especially after the revolution, the Russian Revolution, in Moscow, or with Moscow as headquarters. It didn't happen. And then World War I also, when it came to it, the workers of the world did not unite. They were like, we're Italians, we're Germans, we're British. They all went to their national identities. And so they were like, something's wrong. We didn't get into this kind of universal human identity or worker identity or class identity. They went into their national identities. And so they wanted to figure out how to overcome that. And the goal was that you have to kind of coax people into seeing themselves as part of a class, and then coax that class into seeing itself as something that can be revolutionary if it understands the true nature of class society. This has been refined and refined and refined and refined for 100 years. I mentioned Paulo Freire. He developed it extensively in the 60s, 70s, going into the 80s, and turned it into literally a model of education. So now it's very quick, it's very efficient. It's almost in perfect parallel, if you read Robert J. Lifton, to the process of thought reform that was employed in the Chinese prisons under Mao to get people to see from the people's standpoint. It was the point of those is to brainwash you. That's where we get the word brainwash. If you didn't know that, Xinao in Chinese, wash brain, was the Chinese being blunt as they are. You speak Mandarin, right?
Yeah, Xinao.
Yeah. So they're very blunt people. They just tell you what it is. Why do we call them struggle sessions? Because docheng, because struggle. You have to struggle with it. So they just say it. But yeah, so this brainwashing process in the Chinese prisons mirrors this in kind of a more crude, brutal fashion. But they've got it very sophisticated now to get you to snap into a cult consciousness that's rooted in class identity. Hey, you've had these kinds of experiences. Let's talk about your lived experiences. Let's talk about how that made you feel. Don't you realize that there's a bigger explanation for this? It's not just that some people are jerks. That's not a very satisfactory explanation. There's a big answer for this. And if you understand and accept the big answer, there's something we can do about it. We can challenge the entire structure of the system that's causing this and that's going to keep causing it in the future. And that actually can radicalize people into this line of thinking very, very quickly.
It's like a kind of psychopathy.
It is. It's a conspiracy. It's actually a paranoid conspiracy theory that society's been rigged against you by some them that has all the power to rig the society.
Right. Do you think that this ideology, does it appeal to those who have a tendency towards psychopathy?
I would say that is the case, yes. Certain personality disorders and certain forms of psychopathy, I think it does appeal to them. So it's like a magnet to those people. Psychopathy itself is a little bit more tricky because these people, it's almost like being colorblind to empathy. It's like whatever piece in your architecture, your neural architecture in your brain that makes you empathetic, that makes you understand what it is to truly, act on a human level. It's just not there. And there's something pitiable about that situation. But these people will gravitate towards something like this because it enables them to achieve status in a very efficient and low cost way. You adopt a certain perspective, you cry about how you've been wronged all the time, and you get advanced. It also, though, attracts and nourishes, and probably when you deal with children, creates kind of vulnerable narcissists. It gets people to focus on themselves and how they've been wronged, and to feel into that all the time. And then that's kind of its own spiraling thing. Different views, though, like schizoidal personality, borderline personality, antisocial personality, might be drawn to it for other reasons. But it taps into anywhere you feel like there's that sense of aggrievement that the world's not structured to suit you. And all of these things that you think have gone wrong for random reasons have a cohesive explanation. It really lures in and attracts those people. The goal is always to identify and exploit vulnerability and then turn it to cult doctrine. All cult initiation follows that.
Which will be in your upcoming book, I'm guessing, to some degree, about Marxism as a religion.
The Theology of Marxism book will cover that. I just did because people are not going to want to necessarily have to wait that long. There was a series of videos. I did a workshop in Phoenix, Arizona at the beginning of June. And we did, myself and a colleague each did 3 2-hour lectures. So there'll be 6 2-hour lectures covering the theology of Marxism and the role of this theology he covered mostly how it's been applied to society at large and the church in specific. And I covered the theory, Hegel, then Marx, and then kind of this next phase of conscientization. So the third lecture is specifically on conscientization, and it talks about the thought reform prisons and how these things are lined up.
What will you do if the grid goes down? How will you survive without food, water, and heat? Introducing One Sunrise, the first of its kind in massive on-demand power, instantly available at any residential, commercial, or remote location. Power your home, your office, your EV, your RV, your farm, your cabin, your bug-out bunker, your glamping weekend with the family, or all of them. Bring instant power to any situation, anywhere. Non-toxic, cobalt and lead-free, as well as fire-resistant. One Sunrise mobile power stations are made to run in over 100-degree temps or at -20. For when the grid goes down, there's One Sunrise. Visit onesunrise.com to learn how you can prepare today for no power tomorrow. Let me read something to you, and this comes out of your book, Cynical Theories. It's towards the end, and you've got these sections. I want to say this chapter is an alternative to the ideology of social justice, and you have principled opposition. Example 1. You say, we affirm that racism remains a problem in society and needs to be addressed. We affirm, that's the bolded part. And then here's the second part that I have a question about. You say, we deny, that's the bolded part, that critical race theory and intersectionality provide the most useful tools to do so. So given what we've described, I asked the question, what is critical race theory? And we've talked through some of that. I know we didn't talk through intersectionality, but let's just focus on the critical race theory part. You said we deny that critical race theory provides the most useful tools to combat racism in society. And I think based on what you've said, we can see why that is fraught with pitfalls. But what is the proper means to combat racism in society? Should the state be involved? Are collectively groups of people involved, or do we do this individually? I mean, what is the proper mechanism to teach people, I guess, the wrongness of racism, and how do you fix that, and will it ever be fixed?
The bad news first. Racism's never going to go all the way away. It is a belief that people can hold. It is a matter ugly as it may be, of personal conscience. And I've long ago finally relinquished the idea that if your movement depends on everybody deciding to think that in a certain way, you're tilting at windmills. You're not going to get there. I don't think that we're ever going to eliminate racism completely. I do think that we had already taken tremendous strides to lessening and maybe even minimizing its impacts. The state does get involved and individuals get involved. These are two different domains, kind of a macro and micro circumstance. The macro circumstance.
What's the proper role of the state? Yeah, in the macro sense, what's the proper role of the state in combating racism? I mean, we have the Civil Rights Act and movement.
Yeah, so that's
where we've criminalized. Okay.
Yeah, Civil Rights Act, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, for example. We can, if we want to add in out of the race dimension, we can add in the 19th Amendment, where women gain suffrage in a different domain. So this idea that we're going to have a society that at the level of the law does what it can to be race blind or identity blind, and to, justice is supposed to be wearing a blindfold, holding scales in one hand and a sword in the other. And so to show that we're not being partial in our adjudications. So the Civil Rights Act properly interpreted, the 14th Amendment properly interpreted, where we don't add in layers of this class is protected and that class is not protected. And this is a subtle thing that happened, but where everybody gets the same protections under the law and that law is upheld, I think is the role the state plays in this. When I say that there's a subtle thing here, I should mention what that is. Things like race and sex, particularly disabled status, are what are called protected classes. That's fine. You can say that race is a protected class in that it has a title within the Civil Rights Acts that protect it. But what's happened is that certain races have been shifted into protected classes, while other races are no longer protected. And
I just spoke last week with Kenny Hsu, president of Colorists United, who about this very problem. I mean, the discrimination, for example, that Asians face in university admissions processes, for example, because their test scores are so much outrageously higher a standard than, say, blacks.
Yes.
400-point higher SAT, I think you mentioned. So it manifests as a kind of, when you force equality of outcomes or equity.
Yes.
There's a state-sanctioned forced inequality.
Correct. Discrimination, actually.
Discrimination.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
And so there's this kind of weird, class-conscious shift in the definition that's actually created. One of the problems that we live in is we have two constitutional paradigms in the United States right now. One of which is, broadly speaking, originalist, and one of which is this kind of post-civil rights era where protected class went from, race as a class of way, as a way to classify people, to specific classes with a class identity being treated as what's the protected class, black being, or people of color being protected classes, whereas whichever is designated as dominant is no longer a protected class. That's a Marxist way of thinking about it. And so we actually are operating in two constitutional paradigms with regard to what equal protection under the law means, one of which tries to make up for things and one of which does not. And I think that it is the state's role to stay neutral to the greatest degree possible in this, but also to enforce, to make sure that if there is racist intent, or even if there's not racist intention, but that there's some kind of, consistent issue with discrimination, that there's at least an investigation, a hearing.
How can you measure intent?
Well, that's the hard part about the whole thing, is intention.
It's like Minority Report.
Correct. It's extremely difficult. Sometimes you can catch people on, a hot mic, or that they've written something down that they shouldn't have, or whatever, and you can detect that there was intention. So this is really kind of the difficult area in the law where a lot of this come up. The same kind of thing comes up, by the way, and I think feminism has nucleated around this a lot, with the intention with rape. Rape is or sexual assault in general is an extraordinarily hard thing to prove, because it often involves two people who are in a private situation. Nobody's spying on them or paying attention. Nobody can see what's going on. So it comes down to his word versus her. No, she said it was fine, and she says, no, I didn't, or vice versa, or whatever. So When you have these very gray areas in the law, the state aspect becomes quite impotent, which creates a great deal of frustration and a great deal of room for exploitation. So I'm going to punt on the question of how you prove intent, except that in some cases it is, and to acknowledge that it is a very high bar.
You start to go down this path when you talk about intent, which I understand criminally can be important. You start to get into the arena, again, that is weaponized, of implicit bias, unconscious bias. And while on the one hand, it's even dangerous to judge intent behind what people do say, and you hear them say, now you start to get into the arena where people didn't do or say anything, but I just know based on the group identity that you have these implicit biases that we're going to have to beat out of you or else. And,
right.
Our military members still write to me today mentioning their disgust with some of the diversity and inclusion trainings they're still being subjected to. They're not going away anytime soon. It's a part of the Biden administration's policy. And so it's used, there's a current moment and a platform that is leveraged by people who really seem keen on teaching this stuff. Implicit bias and unconscious bias, they even have their own trainings. And we train people to recognize what they can't otherwise recognize about their beliefs or their value systems. And people sit there and scratch their head and wonder why they're spending their time doing this.
Dojang.
Yeah.
I strongly recommend people in those situations go read Robert J. Lifton's book from the 60s titled Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. They will recognize in the Chinese prisons the DEI workshops, the unconscious bias workshops, where they're being taught to recognize from an ideological perspective the contents of their life. In those prisons, what would happen is you would be accused of some crime and arrested, hauled off to prison. They'd throw you in a cell with people who were further along the path than you, maybe 8 or 9 others. Those people would struggle you. Their point was to prepare you to confess your crimes, to make you feel like confessing your crimes relieves all the pressure on you and makes your life better. And then every day you would go to interrogation. And in interrogation, they would say, you've been accused of a lot of crimes against the Chinese people or against the government. Confess them, and you have no idea what you did. And you start trying to guess at what you did. You have unconscious crimes. And the name that they gave for the process, or the goal of the process, is to learn to recognize your crimes from the people's perspective or from the people's standpoint. And so what they're trying to do is, well, you see, you took this test. We've proved that you have unconscious bias with racism. And now we're going to give you this training to teach you to recognize your crimes so that you can confess to the racism you didn't even know you were participating in.
That's crafty.
It's very crafty. And then as you admit it, and you confess to it, and you testify to it, and so, in the prisons, they'll say, well, I did have that friend, then he did go back and forth to France, and maybe I did tell him things that would constitute passing information, so maybe it was espionage. You start to believe that you were accidentally doing espionage, and then from the people's perspective, that you start to believe that was, unconsciously intentional. And they get you to confess to things that are completely fabricated. They only exist in this topsy-turvy worldview that they've kind of forced onto you. And it, whether it's prison, whether it's a DEI workshop, an unconscious bias workshop, whether it's social emotional learning in schools, it's all the same thing. Now, I want to actually say, just as a point, when we said in that we affirm racism exists and that we deny critical race theory has the right tools, I want to give a medical analogy for what we meant with that, if you will. So imagine you're out working on the farm or whatever, you catch yourself on the barbed wire, you cut yourself, it swells up, it gets infected, right? And so you're going to have to put some kind of an antibiotic on it. You're going to have to treat it somehow. You go to the doctor. If the doctor was the analogous to a critical race theorist, they're going to say this is a systemic problem, that in fact, what's happening here, the reason that it's swollen up and filled with pus and all this, well, that pus is white blood cells and they're doing all this. So the reason that it's actually happening is your immune system. And so if we suppress your immune system, that problem will stop. So we're going to put you on immunosuppressants and chemotherapy in order to get the reaction, the inflammation, the swelling, et cetera, to stop, because it's a systemic inflammation that's causing all of the problems that you're having with the cut. And when we say that critical race theory is a wrong tool, I therefore am emphatically saying that because of the way that it approaches the issue of racism, it does not possess the necessary perspective to diagnose the problem correctly. Neither does it have, because it comes from the wrong perspective, the correct way to prescribe a medicine that will make the problem better.
Well, in fact, if you applied that, using that analogy and teasing it out a bit further, if you apply the wrong procedure based on that diagnosis, you can infect the entire organism and destroy the entire thing.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, this is a deeper point. I put this on Twitter yesterday or the day before.
One of 10,000 tweets
10,000 tweets yesterday. I put it on there, but that people don't understand that the religion, the dialectical religion, is a religion of transformation. Therefore, it is a religion of everything is becoming what it is supposed to be. It's not what it's supposed to be yet, but it's in the process of becoming that thing. And so when they say, for example, that the military or the school or the United States is systemically racist, it behooves them to make it become that so that it becomes visible for everybody. This is what Lenin meant when he said accelerate the contradictions. The point was to accelerate them so that they would become visible to everybody. So then they would realize the truth of the communist theory that would justify the power of the Bolshevik party that had taken over. So when they insist that the military, for example, is systemically racist, the process of the first part of their process is to make sure it becomes that way. And then their diagnosis is correct. But it has to be revealed in actuality. Actuality is this deep thing from Hegel where all this stuff kind of stems from. Where actuality isn't what's real. I'd say, no, it's an actual book. You'd hold it up and say, yeah, it's actual, like it's a real thing. That's what we think it means. But actuality has this really complicated understanding from Hegel, which has been adopted by all of this dialectical thought, which is what is actual is different than what is real. What is actual is what has been made real. And so when they say that what has been actualized, and so they are attempting to actualize the first step is to actualize the contradictions so that they become visible. Make oppression visible is one of the things they always say that they're doing. And so if they make the entire organism sick, then they'll say, see how sick it is? Your whole system is sick. There's an underlying disease process, blah, blah, blah. It's not just that you cut yourself and that they got infected a little bit.
Those are great thoughts, good analogy. This will really resonate with people who are seeing this in their workplace, are subjected to these trainings. I shared this in another podcast. I'll share it again. The Air Force, and I think the entire DoD had done this, but when Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin came in to office in, I think, January of 2021, he issued a series of policy memoranda in which he laid out what our truest national security threats were, and it was COVID-19, it was global climate change, and white supremacy, which didn't really resonate with our service members. But then, we've teed up a conversation about white supremacy. He testified about it before the House and Senate Armed Services Committees, among other places that he was talking about that problem of white supremacy. And then he issued a policy memorandum in which he directed all commanders and senior enlisted leaders to have a down day where we take a knee from our actual official military training mission and we discuss extremism. But everyone knew what he meant by extremism because he'd already been making it plainly clear what he meant. And then we received training materials, and in the training materials were examples of white supremacists over the past decade or more who had been caught here and there in the military and held accountable for participating actively in white supremacy groups. But a part of our training that service members were supposed to receive, commanders were supposed to instruct them about these things that they probably knew very little about. And so you had the entire active duty force getting on their computers, even at work, probably on their federal government workstations, and they were Googling things like history of the KKK. They're Googling what are white supremacy groups, because they don't even know the names of any white supremacy groups. They'd heard of the Proud Boys because that had been a talking point during the last year, at least, of Trump's administration. And so anyway, everyone spends time for a month Googling things, learning about it, preparing for these conversations that we had been mandated to participate in. And then the DoD announced that it was actually going to be pulling data from our government computers to see what it is that we're actually searching for on the internet. And it revealed statistically that look at all these searches for white supremacy related organizations. Look at all the hits that we're getting. We told you we have a problem. So it created an environment in which a certain idea was to be discussed. People start then taking an interest in it, discussing it, and then we're all guilty. Like the climate is, look, we told you all it took was a little bit of a data pull for us to show you that in fact you do have a problem. You're focused on this stuff far too much, and everyone, I imagine that there was only a small, minority of the service members who recognized exactly what had happened, but for months they'd laid a trap.
Yeah,
and we fell into the trap. Yeah.
The 100 Flowers campaign. This is what Mao did. Mao, at one point, after he gets his power, he comes out and he says, no, a flourishing Chinese democracy or democratic republic or whatever he's calling it, flourishing Chinese people has to have free speech. So we're going to have free speech. Let 100 flowers bloom. So the Baihua, 100 flowers. And so let's have the 100 flowers shall bloom. And he let everybody have free speech for a period of time. And they just made lists of everybody who denounced the government. And then they went and killed all of them at the end of it. It was a deliberate campaign to rat out, or to get the people who were dissident to the regime to rat themselves out. And then they used it against him. It's amazing to find out that our military actually did the 100 Flowers campaign strategy against its own people to justify its so-called extremism stand down, which again, I strongly urge these people not to read my work, but to go get a copy of Robert Lifton's book, which is called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, a study of brainwashing.
That's a good recommendation.
It is. I read this on a plane. What a shock. I was flying home one night from, I think it was on a flight from Denver, and I was looking out the window, and I was reading this book, and it's one of these books. It's not quite like reading one of the, the concentration camp Nazi books, but it's like intense at points, and you have to kind of put it down and, reorient your mind. And I remember I was looking out the window. It was dark out. It had just got dark. And I was looking out the window of the plane at some city or whatever down on the ground. And I was like, this can't happen here. We cannot let this happen here. And then it just clicked. I was like, this is happening here. This has been happening here. And so the process, I urge it, is just like what you described, even though this, I framed it in terms of the 100 Flowers campaign. I urge people very seriously to understand that I mentioned that there was struggle and there was interrogation, but in the cell outside of interrogation, where you're learning to confess and recognize your crimes, that your struggle session in your cell is supposed to help, there's one other major component, which in Chinese was shuixi, which is study. So you would study the Marxist literature, you would study the people's history of China. And so here you have the same kind of thing. They have to study what extremism looks like. We have to take a one day, stand down. We're going to take a day off of our normal duties, and we're going to study what's going on in the society and so on. And
tell me the name of this. Yeah. Tell me the name of that guy again. Joseph?
Robert J. Lifton, Jay.
Yeah, not Joseph. Robert Lifton.
No Josephs.
No Joseph.
My grandfather.
Robert, not Joseph Lifton.
Yes, Jay. And
okay.
Yeah, he's got a number of books. He was a psychologist and spent a great deal of time in Hong Kong I think in the 40s or the 50s. I mean, right after. It was during Mao's first campaign when he gathered the data to write this book. Not during the Cultural Revolution, which was later in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, let me read something about this. Reminds me of something I included in my book. This will take 2 minutes, but I think it's worthwhile inject at this point. In chapter 5 of my book, as I talk about my own survival, my SEER training experience with the Air Force, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. They try and, without saying too much about the training, coerce confessions from us as prisoners in a prisoner of war camp. And what you're talking about with Robert J. Lifton's work, it reminds me of this segment here, an italicized vignette that I've included at the beginning of chapter 5. I write, before Vietnam, during the Korean War, hundreds of U.S. Air Force men were held captive by Chinese communists in North Korea and China. After the Korean armistice, 235 such men were returned by the Chinese to the United States. Not surprisingly, the U.S. Air Force expended considerable effort to investigate the experiences of these men so that we might have a full and accurate account of the tactics and techniques that were employed by these Chinese communist captors. On November 13th, 1956, 3 years after the war ended, a report was presented at a combined meeting of the Section on Neurology and Psychiatry at the New York Academy of Medicine as part of a panel discussion on, quote, communist methods of interrogation and indoctrination. And this is, again, it's what you're about to hear is exactly what you've been describing from Lifton's work. It's what they try and do to us in our SEER training to teach us something. And I find this fascinating. The report focuses primarily on Chinese communist efforts to extort false confessions from American prisoners, something half of American POWs experienced while they were in Chinese communist captivity. Rather than inflict physical violence, as the prisoners perhaps feared most, the communist captors would seek to manipulate the beliefs, statements, and conduct of prisoners by establishing controlled environments and through the extortion of false confessions. Why coerce false confessions? Because at least for some prisoners, the repetition of false confessions of guilt over time convinced them they were actually guilty of something. Acquiescence to the idea of one man's own actual guilt in turn bred self-loathing, self-resentment, generated an internal struggle that was more successful than even the exogenously imposed torment of a captor. In the end, it was psychologically crippling, turning the captive into a compliant pawn. And so their report describes how, there was this effort to shape human compliance through these coerced confessions. And it was a kind of teaching procedure, or shuishi, as you've pointed out. It was them re-educating the people that were under their control. The Geneva Conventions, I point out, of August 12th, 1949, which among other things established the standards of international law for the humanitarian treatment of combatants during war, expressly prohibit any form of coercion used to, quote, secure from POWs information of any kind whatsoever. Perhaps you think that's unlikely and you'd be right, but just wait. Oh, okay, no, sorry, that's me. Let me skip forward. Let me just summarize by saying the very thing that was outlawed in the Geneva Conventions of 1949, we are now using as a government in our own country through policy and through our D&I trainings. And it's the point I'm trying to make in this book where, what you saw bullies doing in the streets of 2020, which was Marxist in nature, it's Maoist in nature, forcing or coercing these confessions from citizens of their own guilt and shaping their compliance. Governments are now doing in the federal agencies and our military, and making, in this effort to kind of make even our military service members shaped into compliant pawns of a particular agenda. And to speak out against it is fearful for people because they recognize that they're going to identify themselves as being an enemy to the cause or an enemy of the agenda. And, if that's not Marxist or communist, I don't know what is. I mean, it really is an aggressive agenda. And they do it with a smile on their face with nice words, which makes it so damn dangerous. I mean, it's really dangerous.
It is. If I recall, and I've heard, of course, of the airmen that were taken in the Korean War before. If I recall correctly, that part of the famous revelation that came out, and maybe you can correct me if I've got my stories mixed up, but one of the famous revelations was that they expected not just brutal physical punishment, but also to have been consistently mistreated. But they were often given these kind of weird alternating patterns of psychological brutality and extreme leniency. The POWs when they got home were describing just how shocked they were that the Americans had propagandized and said, well, their communists are so brutal, blah, 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 but they're actually really nice. They had brutal moments, but then they were so kind and so interested and yada, yada, yada. And again, we turn back to Lifton. I'll read a couple paragraphs to give you a sense, since it injects. This is early in the book where he's actually describing the psychological steps of thought reform, which is how he translated wash brain. And so the section, he says, this section is about death and rebirth, because the idea is actually to cause a death of the old person and a rebirth into a new man. And he's these two characters.
That's a cult.
It is a cult. Yeah. And
Yeah,
it turns out that's how Paulo Freire explains the process of conscientization, and the purpose of education is to have the educator and the student die and be reborn on the side of the oppressed. That's what he called the pedagogy of the oppressed.
Okay.
So he's got these two characters, Dr. Vincent and Father Luca, that he's detailed their treatment. So that's who these two characters are. But he says both Dr. Vincent and Father Luca took part in an agonizing drama of death and rebirth. In each case, it was made clear that the reactionary spy, and that's in quotes, who entered the prison must perish, and that in his place must arise a new man, resurrected in the communist mold. Indeed, Dr. Vincent still used the phrase, quote, to die and be reborn, words which he had heard more than once during his imprisonment. Neither of these men had himself initiated the drama. Indeed, at first both had resisted it and tried to remain quite outside of it. But their environment did not permit any sidestepping. They were forced to participate, drawn into the forces around them until they themselves began to feel the need to confess and to reform. This penetration by the psychological forces of the environment into the inner emotions of the individual person is perhaps the outstanding psychiatric fact of thought reform. The milieu brings to bear upon the prisoner a series of overwhelming pressures, at the same time allowing only a very limited set of alternatives for adapting to them. In the interplay between person and environment, a sequence of steps or operations, of combinations of manipulation and response takes place. All of these steps resolve about two policies and two demands: the fluctuation between assault and leniency, and the requirements of confession and re-education. The physical and emotional assaults bring about the symbolic death. Leniency and the developing confession are the bridge between death and rebirth. The re-education process, along with final confession, create the rebirth experience. And so that's how he describes the process of Chinese thought reform prisons. With these people, Vincent and Luca, and the other people he interviewed to construct this book, were, as you might say, fresh off the boat. He was in Hong Kong, and when these Westerners would get out of the Chinese thought reform prison, their sentence virtually always included, "You've got to leave China." And so they would put them on a boat, ship them to Hong Kong, best of luck. And he was catching them, Lifton was catching them within a few days, usually within the first week or so that they were getting off the boat. So they're still, he often described that they're still like kind of dazed and starry-eyed and trying to figure out what happened. It's a 7-day boat ride or 6 or 7 day, depending on where they came from, to Hong Kong. And then within a week of arriving in Hong Kong, he was usually meeting with them. So within just a few weeks of being out of the prison, he's already talking to them about their experience. And you hear this process, this psychiatric assault that they do. And it's just why I said I was reading this book, and it's like I'm looking out the plane window thinking, oh my gosh, this is what they've done to us. They've made this systemic.
That I like, you call them the Chinese thought reform prisons. I'm going to start using that phrase to describe society. I mean, ask the question: are we living in an American thought reform prison? And essentially, a lot of what we're seeing, I'd say the answer is yes.
I think that is correct.
But they've turned all of society into a thought reform prison.
And he explains that thought reform is his kind of clinical translation of Shinao. Wash brain.
Brainwashing.
Yeah, brainwashing.
Yeah, wash brain.
Wash brain. Shisho. Shisho. Every time I go to
China.
China.
Hand washing.
Wash hands. Wash hands.
Shisho, Jian. Tell me where the Shisho, Jian, is. It's the hand wash room.
Yeah.
That's the bathroom. Shisho, Jian.
Shisho, Jian.
So, all right. So we've talked. Most of this interview has been a discussion about the American thought reform prison and how critical race theory has a tremendously significant role in that thought reform and Shinao process. Here's what I want to do with the time remaining. At the risk of this being a 4-hour podcast, I don't want to do that either to you or me or our listener. I'd like to have a kind of a rapid fire round of questions now, because there's like 6 other things that I've got written down that I'd really like to at least have you touch upon.
I'll pretend I'm on TV.
Okay, yeah, let's pretend, but not not pretend so much because you only get 60 seconds there. You're welcome to take 120 seconds here if you'd like. There's a number of important things that you have been hitting on Twitter and your public speeches. And so in case not everyone who's listening has heard of some of these things, I'd like them to hear about them today. And then if you'd like to know more information about them, go look into them and go look at newdiscourses.com and see James's work. So let's take as much time as is necessary, but still within a round of rapid fire questions. What is ESG? Okay. What does that stand for? What is it? And what's happening here?
ESG is environmental social governance scoring. And so you have to understand that it is a scoring system that they're using primarily with corporations. It could be moved to individuals as well, which would then be a social credit score, to rate them in terms of their environmental, social, and governance policy within, let's say, if it's a corporation, within their corporate structure. This is billed as being a way to gauge or to approximate long-term investment. They're likely to be long-term profitable if they have the correct environmental, social, and corporate governance policy. And maybe that would be true if it were this kind of data-driven, open-ended, competitive field of what defines good environmental and social, especially policy. Corporate governance is its own kind of managerial thing, but it's actually a very captured frame. A very small number of people have decided what the correct environmental policy is. We see this with, this huge green energy push, this whole push away from fossil fuels and nuclear. Your paper straws are good environmental policy, apparently, even when they come in a plastic bag. Whatever. They said that mask wearing was good environmental policy because COVID-19 represented an environmental hazard. So 160 billion masks floating in the ocean, or whatever the number is good environmental policy because it prevented an environmental problem. Social policy is almost virtually this DEI-based, social justice-driven agenda. Now, so
is ESG, could you consider it like an umbrella under which now CRT is falling, yes, or the diversity, inclusion, equity, yes, industry falls?
Correct.
Because it's all wrapped up under the S.
Yes, that's in the S. It's probably 80 to 90% of the S. Now, they also said it was good social scores to sell weapons for Ukraine because that's a social problem that we have to solve. So now weapons manufacturing becomes socially responsible because of this particular problem. So you can kind of see how it's fake. But all of the DEI, I would say the S score in ESG is determined 80 to 90% with compliance with the diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, justice, whatever other words they add into it, program that they've set up. And so the question is about corporate responsibility. Does it have a corporate social responsibility demand on it? What does that look like? And they've got a very narrow definition. And your score goes up if you participate, and it goes down if you don't. This is why DEI training is in every corporation.
I didn't let you get to the G, but who's enforcing this? A corporation's compliance, or who is scoring them in this ESG compliant arena?
Largely the super large financial institutions and banks.
So why is it them?
BlackRock are by far the two biggest. Fidelity, State Street are up there. Goldman Sachs is up there. JP Morgan is on the list. This kind of
they're the drivers.
These are the main drivers. These are the ones who have cooked up and implemented this kind of narrow definition. They're in cahoots with the World Economic Forum and the United Nations as well. The United Nations has decided that these are the key metrics that will push us toward their so-called sustainable development goals. There are 17 goals to transform the world. It's a very Marxist phrase for you. And that's who's driving this. That's what this is. It is actually...
So bankers, the wealthy.
Yes.
And you've got the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab and others that we've been hearing about. And we've got the United Nations.
Yes. That's overwhelmingly it. I mean, the World Bank is involved, but we're just talking about bankers again at this point.
They're not even hiding the terms they're using. I mean, they're talking about the Great Reset of the global economy and of the world order.
Sounds very much like
they're being very... It sounds like a giant communist revolution.
It is. Yeah, that's correct. It's exactly what it is. Operated through banks and corporations, primarily.
Who are kindly and smile and behind, at least publicly.
There are stakeholders. Now, the trick is that people need to understand is the way that they're doing this is that they're leveraging, as it's called in the business, other people's money. They're leveraging primarily everybody's retirements, everybody's pensions. These bankers have set up passive investment mutual fund type programs where they are the stewards of lots and lots and lots of other people's money. I mean, maybe $10 trillion of other people's money, an unfathomable amount of money. And that's what they're using to leverage. That's what they're using to. So BlackRock maybe manages $6 trillion in other people's assets. And then what they do with that is they go and they buy nearly controlling shares of lots of corporations that they then threaten to pull. They also set up as an investment capital firm. They then set up, well, if you want us to invest in your company, if you want us to buy shares, etc., you've got to be compliant with our social, environmental.
And if you're not compliant, they can cripple your business.
We will drop you.
Cripple a corporation.
You will not have investment capital. The biggest reservoir of investment money in the world is going to bail out on you. Your stock price is going to plummet in a crisis in one day. Good luck to you from there. So they've got almost a financial gun to the heads of these corporations. Mm-hmm. I don't know if maybe Disney wants to be woke, maybe Coca-Cola wants to be woke, but I'm willing to bet that there is in reality, a bell curve of corporate attitudes about whether or not they want to be woke. And it's not
but
of
they've
them
got a vested
one tiny
financial interest.
That's right, the vested financial interest. And so the way I often phrase it in public talks is, if you want to control a bull, and you have the bull of Wall Street, if you want to control the bull of Wall Street, you've got to get a ring through its nose that you can pull it around by. And ESG is the ring they put through the bull on Wall Street.
Wow. Okay, that's very helpful. The G. Did we talk about the G?
G is corporate governance. That's why you hire officers DEI and ESG officers. And this is also why you have to have diverse C-suites in lots of companies. If you don't have at least one woman and whatever other diverse panel that they decide on your board, then you have a low governance score. So your ESG score overall will be low. Like I said, it's a scoring metric. What they're doing is they're rating your business in terms of how ESG compliant you are, claiming that that's a proxy for long-term profitability, and then using that as a justification to invest large amounts of other people's money in what should be a stable long-term bet.
Are the ESG scores public?
Most companies do have their ESG scores listed publicly. You can actually look them up in a lot of cases. I don't know if they're required to. I do know that, for example, the governor of Oklahoma runs I don't know as governor that he still runs it, but he did run a financial business previously, and on their website, they proudly advertise that they have a perfect ESG score.
Did you see the natural gas plant or headquarters or one of its?
Yes.
I think it's in, where in Oklahoma was that?
Central northern Oklahoma.
There's been some explosions and it's been on fire, and they've evacuated the citizens within like a 2-mile radius.
Yeah, it's nuts.
I wonder if it was ESG compliant.
Yeah, well, I don't know. Tesla is not ESG compliant once Elon Musk started to speak up about how he's not sure about how some of this stuff works.
Right. Okay, let's move on. This is the rapid fire round of questions. What is stakeholder capitalism?
Stakeholder capitalism has a pronunciation. So it's a new form of capitalism. We'll give it that shrift. It's a new form of capitalism in which people who are designated as stakeholders or stakeholder representatives make the big calls about how things have to be organized on the macro level. So you have a council of stakeholders who works in concert. These are big swinging players. Like, for example, Bill Gates is often on these kind of stakeholder panels. Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum guys are going to be on that. Mark Benioff would be a major stakeholder. They're the people who know, and they have a council that's going to make the big picture decisions about maybe what ESG scores are going to be and not be. Why Elon Musk speaking up makes his social score have to go down, for example, and his ESG score tank at Tesla. So the stakeholders are, and I keep saying it's a council because I don't know if you speak Russian or how many people speak Russian. I speak very little.
Хорошо.
Yeah, I don't speak Russian, but I do know the word for council in Russian, which is Soviet. And so stakeholder capitalism is a Soviet enterprise in the literal meaning of the word to take over the macro scale organization of corporate governance and its connection to large foundation and government entities.
I mean, they're telling you in this word or this term, stakeholder capitalism, what they're doing, but it's crafty again because they're using the word capitalism as if like, oh, this is all a good thing, it's healthy, but we still believe in capitalism, but the stakeholders are going to start to determine.
Well, they trick you on stakeholder too, because
okay,
let's say with the schools, right? Your children are receiving an education in the schools. That means you as a parent are a primary stakeholder in what the school is doing, in the literal meaning of the word stakeholder. And this is the way most people understand what it is to be a stakeholder. So they sell you the idea that the stakeholders are somehow all the people who are affected by the corporations. But you can't have all the people actually tell you what they think. Instead, what you do is you have a council, like the European Union or something, that's going to make the decisions on behalf of all the people that they claim to represent. So you have stakeholder experts who form the council to make the decisions, but those decisions are being made on behalf of the actual stakeholders. So the idea is that it's pretending to be responsible to the people who actually have a stake in what's going on, while actually removing all accountability.
So it's the Soviet stakeholders who are really in charge on behalf of all of the other stakeholders who at least got to choose who all of their wise council members were.
See, you're a stakeholder in climate policy, but you're probably too stupid to know what's really going on. So Bill Gates is going to determine it for you.
Right. Okay, so you've mentioned public education a couple times. I've seen that you've talked about child grooming. In what way is child grooming taking place? And I'm changing gears here. Where is it happening? How is it happening? And how do parents recognize when it's happening so they can get involved and stop it?
I mean, so it's happening everywhere, basically, at this point. In the entertainment industry, I would say that there's a huge 1-2 punch between the entertainment industry and the schools. That's a huge, huge thing. Social media is another. I would classify that broadly under the entertainment industry. So there's this kind of background noise where the kids are being introduced to these concepts. Now, I'm also being a little more narrow, and I'm actually talking, I think most people when they hear the word grooming do think of the sexual aspect, but I actually mean it more in terms of thought reform, cult grooming, more broadly. They are interrelated, as a matter of fact. And the primary thing that's happening is a cult grooming. They're using the sexual stuff primarily to facilitate the cult grooming, though there is some actual sex grooming happening as well. I think it's kind of a catastrophe that's riding along and is not the primary intent of the cult grooming process. But the basic idea is that through one means or another, often through the entertainment industry or social media, they're priming the children with questions about sex, sexuality, etc. Then they go to school, and then they are fed further information. If they haven't been primed at home, they'll get primed there. And then when those questions arise, they're being put into what are called, and this is, if you had to like narrow it down to one simple thing for parents to watch out for, is anywhere that they have so-called affirmative care or social transitioning in kind of an affirmative affirmation-based system, they're grooming your kids to be unstable and unsure about issues of sex, gender, and sexuality. From there, there's lots of different avenues of exploitation, most of which is going to be to kind of funnel them into queer activism, which may or may not involve adopting an identity. But there will also be, an open door to actual sexual abuse, which we are seeing in an unfortunate number of school systems as well, because children who are comfortable talking about sex and sexuality at school with their teachers or people that they trust are less likely, contrary to what they actually tell you, are less likely to realize that something inappropriate is going on, and they're therefore less likely to report it, etc. So what parents need to be watching for is anything that has to do with affirmative care, affirmation. It's your school system or whatever is really far gone if they're actually socially transitioning kids. I would tell parents also that one of the things they need to be watching out for is anything in the school system that varies state by state what's allowed, where they're enabling medical treatment to take place in the school without parent involvement, to say nothing of parent consent, without parent involvement. You have a lot to be worried about. That could be as simple as getting kids put on things like Ritalin or Adderall or some,
without even
concentration
informing
drug
parents.
with no parents involved whatsoever
Wow.
behind their backs.
How are
It
they
could be
administering that? They don't get sent home with it? They show up at school and they have it administered, or what?
there are programs of telemedicine. I know this is happening in North Carolina, which has the most, believe it or not, North Carolina has the most lax laws. California and a couple of other famously blue states are kind of next. In California, the age limit is 12 and up. In North Carolina, it's the most lax because there is no age limit at all. It could be pre-K, but they will actually set it up if there are reasons that the adults in the room, if we want to call them that, teachers or whatever, or if the children request it, that they can set up a private telemedicine consultation, like via iPad or Zoom or whatever, with a doctor. They can then do the prescription and keep it all in-house.
That's legal.
That's legal
in North Carolina.
in North
if you're
Carolina,
if you're
and
12
in several
or
other states, 12 and up, and some other states, 15 or 16 and up. And so parents should be paying attention to this because, like I said, it could be these kind of psychoactive hyperactivity drugs. It could be SSRIs and depression, anxiety drugs. It could also, at least in principle, if not in practice in many places, be puberty blockers or transition drugs.
that's terrible.
It's
to say the least.
It is the most alarming catastrophe of policy that I think I've ever seen anywhere, to allow minors to use the school as a backdoor to prescription medical treatment while being affirmed by the social and professional environment in the school into thinking that this is what they need to do to circumvent the role of the parent. As you would think that you're the primary stakeholder, but some other stakeholders know better than you.
That's right. Okay, two more questions, and then we'll wrap things up. Let's turn now to the LGBTQ movement and queer theory. One of the things that you do talk about in Cynical Theories, your book, is queer theory, and all of these cynical theories that you write about are rooted in Marxist ideology, postmodernism. So we just got through Pride Month, and I saw a lot of, I follow all of the military-related Twitter feeds. There's the recruiting services, there's Army feeds and Air Force feeds and Space Force feeds. And not only are we saying, hey, we include you if you're gay or bisexual or transitioning. Bisexual implies two sexes, by the way. But we celebrate you. And now I just saw an announcement that the Air Force put out where they're having a bunch of their transgender service members hosting a panel to talk about, basically the agenda, the trans agenda. So the question I have then, and I'm not asking for a criticism of people, of course. I'm interested in the agenda and the ideological roots of the LGBTQ agenda. Is it accurate to say that the queer agenda, and there is and to be clear for the listener, there's an academic discipline called queer theory, and there's feminine studies and black studies and so on and so forth. Is it fair to say that queer theory is rooted in Marxist ideology?
Yeah, it's queer Marxism. It's the idea that normalcy, just like what we did with race, that whiteness is a special form of property, blah, blah, blah. Exactly the same. Being able to consider yourself normal is a special kind of cultural property that grants you access to society, and other people who are designated as abnormal, who have taken upon themselves the word queer as a positive discourse of resistance, fall outside of that access to that property and its benefits. So it is a Marxist.
Therefore, they're oppressed, and there's an oppressor class, and right. Then you get into the same Marxist
correct
oppressor-oppressed narrative. And
it's actually weirdly even more Marxist than a lot of these other. It's more Marxist than critical race theory if we look back at what Marx was actually talking about. Marx's philosophy, and I don't want to get off on a long tangent with this, but was that really what we are as entities is that we are socially constructed or socially conditioned entities. There is material conditions in society, he said, and the material conditions create a social structure by the interaction of the upper class, the superstructure, and the lower class, the infrastructure. And that socially conditions us. So people in the proletariat only believe so much as possible with their lives because they've been socially conditioned to be limited. And so they have a limited range of subjectivity, is the way that Marx would have phrased that or held it. But within your range of subjectivity is where you can imagine a different life or what life might contain. And so the goal of consciousness is to expand the range of subjectivity in the oppressed to make them believe that they can be history makers. In queer theory, the very fact of your body imprisons you in a range of subjectivity. If you were born in a male body, you are now trapped in a range of what society accepts as what it means to be male. If you were born in a female body, you are now trapped in what it means. So your subjective range is limited to you have to be a woman on the terms society has created for what it means to be a woman. That is the ultimate nature of queer theory, which it tries to break things down by complicating them. That's the word it likes to use. It complicates sex. It complicates gender, complicates sexuality. So when Ketanji Brown Jackson sits on the stand and is asked by Senator Marsha Blackburn, what is a woman? And she fumbles around and can't answer and gives a transphobic response of, I'm not a biologist. The reason that she did that is because the concept of woman has to have been complicated so that people can be liberated from the range of subjective experience that comes with the societal application of the word woman. That they don't think that being a woman itself means almost anything. It means parts, it means certain, small numbers of things like, innie versus outie or whatever. It means chromosomes in a particular arrangement, but not another one. But those aren't, in their view, very deterministic. It's a social environment that's created around those facts of nature that create all of the deterministic kind of things, including possibly even your hormone levels. That you're raised to be a boy, so you're raised so that your testosterone will be higher, yada yada. This is an argument that has been forwarded, sometimes is not forwarded, it goes back and forth. But the fact is that it is the social condition. So when you were assigned your sex at birth, that's the phrase they use, your doctor and your parents locked you into a narrow subjective range of what it means to be how you were born. And this has to be blown open. That categorization itself is doing a violence to you because you might not feel like you fit in that. And so queer theory exists to blow that open. Now, when we say the LGBTQ agenda, this is where I feel like it's very important to be very nuanced. Because in fact, if I were to write out LGBTQ agenda, what I would actually do is put LGB, then I put the T in parentheses, and I put a slash and put the Q. Because the T sometimes goes either way. The trans thing sometimes cuts either way, because there was a very liberal, in the classical liberal sense, civil rights movement for LGB, sometimes T, that I think has unfolded over the past 50 years, but primarily in the last 15 years, that was a legitimate civil rights movement. And people called it in the 90s the gay agenda. That was a mistake, because there was a queer agenda, which was a Marxist sleeper hiding inside of that, which was the real thing. The Q is completely separate. That is not the same thing. None of LGB, as you pointed out, bisexual means there are two. None of that makes any sense under Q. And Q, there are no boundaries, there are no rules, there are no limits. You can't transition under Q because there's no starting place and no finish place. Nothing ever happened. So that's fake. There's no bisexual because that's fake. Lesbian and gay have to be complicated so that sometimes they include straight, etc. And we don't know what men and women are. So the Q is the agenda. The Q is the
Q
slope.
is the agenda, and yet it's lumped in with all of these other letters of the alphabet as if they're all united.
Correct.
In a front.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
do any of them become offended when they understand that and say, "Hey, I don't want to be lumped in with the other letters"?
I have seen through the hijinks of Pride Month, many of which were humiliating. A very large number of people say, "I'm homosexual. Do not call me gay anymore. I'm not down with this whole acronym. Don't call me lesbian anymore. I'm homosexual. It is what it is. It's a fact about who I am. I am not with these people." There are a lot of people, even within what was broadly the LGBTQ whatever movement over the past 20 years, who have realized that a Marxist element in the Q has betrayed them and has ruined everything. By the way, you mentioned the military. You mentioned the Air Force in specific. I'm still pretty pissed off. I don't get pissed off about a lot of these things. But I saw a recruitment tweet from Air Force recruiting of them, of some I guess, cadets or some, I don't know what you call them, sorry. running with the rainbow flag.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I'm like, that's not the American flag. What is going on? I don't
they
even,
replaced
like,
it.
I'm not mad about the rainbow flag, although I'm starting to think it's a colonizer flag that's being colonized by that diagonal wedge that they're sticking in the side of it now. But it's a colonizer's flag that's being colonized. But that's what's funny.
But the fact that
it's
it like
not an American
supplanted
flag.
the American flag and was held by troops in uniform
Correct.
as they jogged in a formation.
I could see the American. I'm not even going to be super strict. I'm not military. I don't know. I could see the American flag, no question. I could see a POW flag. I'm okay with that. I could see an Air Force flag. That's it. That flag is not one of those. It does not belong there. And if I'm wrong about the Air Force flag or the POW flag, that's fine. I'll take the correction. But the American flag, with possibly those two exceptions, I thought about it for a lot. I put way too much time thinking about it. What is the limit of acceptable, in my opinion? Where would I like if it's that blue line flag, which is American flag, changed colors for the police? No. No. Just fly the normal one. You're the military. Just the American flag. But I understand POW, and I don't even know if there's an Air Force flag, to be honest with you. But
yeah, whatever. I'll tell you that you haven't been told, but that is the new Air Force flag.
Well, from what I understand,
LGBTQ flag.
And I know how you guys do. I thought it was the Navy flag, but wait, these are other jokes.
Well, yeah, you're right. And as kindly as many of our service members want to be towards any community, and they have been before all of these trainings began, these are respectful people. They respect one another. They're respectful of others' life choices. They don't want to see people in uniform running with that.
No,
and it's like I saw this meme the other day during Pride Month, and there was this like child backed up against a wall. I think it was a child or a teenager, and there was someone that was playing the tuba, and the tuba had them backed up to the wall, and it was like, I don't know what the caption was. It was something like, "This is what Pride Month actually is." And it's this person playing a tuba, backing people up against a wall. It's like, you will swallow my belief system or else.
Yeah, it is. It is. But I think that the right nuance here, and I'm actually going to push back on a word you use, not to be confrontational, but, we said respectful of communities. No, respectful of individuals.
Oh, did I say
particularly caring? Yeah, we all do it. We've all been a little bit like, this is where we were talking earlier about where there's these two trees that are planted right next to each other.
Right.
And it's so easy to slip between the branches. I don't believe, I watched the divisions. I watched people upset about what we were just discussing. I don't believe that there is anything cohesive known as an LGBT or add whatever letters or take whatever letters you want community. I think that there are people who form communities and that's relevant to it, but that's a different question. There's not some cohesive thing, and especially as a political class. And when we start thinking in terms of political classes, we miss what actually is there. But the nuance that I think is important is that I think there was a huge difference between the gay civil rights, which was not a gay agenda. And then this Marxist sleeper cell that was working within it, that is the queer program. They have
the real QAnon.
And in fact, the Q is even weirder because the Q is like this weird Marxist cannibalization of feminism. It's not got much in common with the others, except that the Q word was used to describe everybody else, right? It's like this weird linguistic trick. It's actually sex positive feminism that decided to just blow out and say anything goes, starting in the 70s and 80s, really formally in the 80s. But it was actually it's a branch of this weird feminism that's kind of like blown out and cannibalized itself. That's the queer theory or the queer Marxism. And it doesn't share a lot. It shares nothing in common with any civil rights action. If you talk to actually gay activists who were active in the liberal aspect of the gay civil rights movement in the 90s, when it was kind of at one of its peaks, they will tell you that one of the biggest fights that they had to fight the social conservatives on the one hand, and they had to fight the queer theorists on the other hand. And I've heard them say, Andrew Sullivan, I'll name who said this. He said that we went out, we got coffee in DC one day. I don't think he's a big fan of mine now, but whatever. We went out and got because Trump. But we went out and got coffee by the Trump Hotel, as it turns out, in D.C. And he's sitting there, we're talking, and he got so upset. He got so mad. And he said, if I ever knew that they were going to force me to be queer, If I had to be queer, like they mean, I never would have come out. He said that we had to fight those people. They didn't want marriage equality because they call that homonormativity. It makes homosexual normal, and they don't want normal. They want it to be outside and excluded and oppressed so that they can use that to foment discontent and revolution.
Excellent points. And, I'll point out an article that I had read 1 year ago, like 2 days ago, July 9th, 2021. Andrew Sullivan wrote an article called "What Happened to You? The Radicalization of the American Elite Against Liberalism."
Yeah.
And it's phenomenal.
It is.
I mean, he says, he opens the article and he says, "What happened to you?" It's a question I get a lot on Twitter. When did you become so far right? Is the question that he gets. Why have you become a white supremacist, a transphobic, a misogynistic eugenicist? And he then goes into this article to describe how ludicrous so much of what we're seeing in the American thought reform prison really is, and how dangerous it is.
See, if we had the vocabulary to understand what was going on and phrased it in a little bit of antiquated language, the opening of this article would be, what happened to you? When did you become a class enemy? That's right. What it is. The Marxist element has colonized and erupted. Some people use the cordyceps mushroom as an example. It's like a parasitic fungus. It gets in a bug. The bug goes and acts weird, and then it grows up out of the ground eventually with a fruiting body that the Chinese go pick and use.
Next time we'll have you on to talk mushrooms.
Well, yeah, I got some turkey tail growing in the yard that just came up. I'm excited about that.
Well, hey, now let me wrap things up by asking you one more question. I've seen you on a number of occasions, various events at which we've spoken together. You sometimes have really neat T-shirts on that have language on them, and one of the T-shirts I saw you wearing said "based" or "I am based" or something like that. What is based?
Well, I think your military audience is going to be able to understand this, because I understand that you guys all have to. Speaking of that flag, I'll have to do jujitsu now. Man, I just got myself in trouble. That was the first fake paper. One of the first fake papers we actually wrote, by the way, was that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because Peter Boghossian practices it.
Yeah, right? Talk about that. So
the fake papers.
Yeah.
So we wrote.
Talk about that real quick. Yeah, and then we'll get into what is based.
Okay, 2017 and 18, myself, Helen Pluckrose, and Peter Boghossian, two of my colleagues, wrote 20 fake academic articles to submit to peer-reviewed academic journals to find out if you can actually just get absolute insanity published or horrible things published because they are politically correct in the kind of woke ideology. And we were, very successful at this. We ended up getting 7 of our 20 articles accepted to publication, some in high-ranking journals, some got awards for excellence in scholarship.
What were some of the titles? I mean, there was one about dogs and dog behavior in the parks.
You see, the hard part is I'm trying to remember. The titles are sometimes complicated because they're academic, but I remember what our nicknames were. So there's the dog park paper that we called Dog Park, but the title was Reactions to Queer Performativity and Heteronormativity or something like that in Urban Dog Parks in Portland, Oregon. So we assessed the idea that rape culture, we assessed the idea of rape culture by using as a implicit bias proxy the way that people reacted to watching dogs hump each other in dog parks, and that you could somehow figure this out. And then we concluded that dog parks are rape condoning spaces, and therefore we should train men the way that we train dogs to combat rape culture. That paper was accepted by...
And it was published.
It was accepted and published by the leading journal in feminist geography, and given an award of excellence in scholarship by that journal.
But they didn't know so did you publish it under your names?
No, we published that under a fake invented person by the name of Helen Wilson. Helen Wilson
got an award.
She got an award, that's right. Yeah.
Terrific. Congratulations.
It was wonderful. Excellence in scholarship. They were going to give it pride of place in the journal that year. And so another one we titled, being kind of cheeky as it were, we titled it Going In Through the Back Door. We insinuated that the reason that straight men are so often transphobic is because they don't practice putting things in their butts. And that was called An Important Contribution to Knowledge and was accepted. We had another paper that was our struggle is my struggle is our struggle, or our struggle is my struggle. Our struggle is my struggle. So, obviously my struggle is Mein Kampf. It was a rewrite of a chapter of Mein Kampf into the language of intersectional feminism, and a social work journal accepted that paper, which is horrifying.
This is phenomenal work.
Yeah, this is great. This is important. And so, there were a bunch of them. And 7 were still under peer review. The Wall Street Journal caught us and told on us before they were done. So there were still 7 out there being decided upon. A sociologist looked at all of it and said probably either 11 or 12 of them would have got in, and 8 or 9 would have failed based on, peer review comments and the quality of the writing, et cetera. So it was a pretty wild thing. But the very first paper, which had no chance, it was never going to get in, that we wrote, was that Brazilian people only practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to have a hetero masculine acceptable outlet of latent homosexuality that they refuse to express in other ways, which, of course, if you've ever been in a BJJ gym, is like a constant underlying joke anyway. I did BJJ a long time ago, but never to any...
BJJ, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Yeah, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which I understand a lot of the military has to do for their hand-to-hand combat training now.
Now we know why.
Because the pride flag. And jokes write themselves. What can you do? So, based. People in the military, because they often know something about hand-to-hand combat, that will understand. The metaphor to the word based is that if you have, that I use anyway, is that if you have good base, it's hard to throw you, right? If you get your weight down, you get your body centered, your center of mass is hanging down low, whatever it takes, you're not going to get flipped over or swept or whatever else. That's kind of the metaphor, but it's that in terms of your principles. And so with this kind of communist subversion, what it means to be based is that you're not easily subverted. In fact, maybe you're not subvertible at all. You understand your principles, you know why they're your principles, and these kind of little manipulations like you're stupid, you're a bad person, you're a racist, you're this and that, they don't really affect you. Because you know who you are and you don't let that kind of influence your thoughts and behavior in a way that's not under your control. So that's what it means to be based. It means that you're basically not manipulable by these different kinds of subversive tactics. And I liked the word because I had practiced martial arts for a long time. And so I know all about the idea that if you don't want to get swept in jiu-jitsu or you don't want to get thrown in judo, it's a matter of having good base. If you want to have power in your strikes, if you're using a striking art, boxing or kickboxing or whatever else, you've got to be, rooted in your base in order to throw a hard kick. And so I liked the idea that there's this like parallelism between what it means to be a solid character in terms of a fighter, a physical fighter, and a solid character in terms of being a principled individual who's not easily manipulated by, say, communist subversion.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Well, I'll leave a final invitation with the listening audience to get based.
Yeah.
We need to get based. We live in the, what we've changed from the Chinese thought reform prison to a kind of growing American thought reform prison that's spreading throughout academia, all of society, and unfortunately, including our uniformed services and federal agencies. And now under the umbrella of ESG, we've got all of America's corporations now under the thumb of woke, powerful capitalist stakeholders, the Soviet Council of the new rulers of capitalism, if you will. But we couldn't have spent our 2 hours better than listening to James Lindsay, Conceptual James at Twitter, and take some time if you want to learn more about these subjects to go visit him at newdiscourses.com as well. And having said that, James, I'm going to give you the last plug here. Anything else, any other plug or pitch you'd like to give for the upcoming books or I guess last thoughts, last comments?
Yeah, sure. The next thing that's going to come out is kind of a significant publication outside of my podcast, which everybody should go listen to the New Discourses podcast if you want to learn a lot more about this. But I have a book coming up that I'm going to call The Marxification of Education. And it's mostly going to explain the educational program of a Brazilian guy by the name of Paulo Freire, who was a Marxist who redesigned education. As I'm going to argue in the book, obviously, he didn't just turn education into Marxist indoctrination. He made education a Marxist theory itself. The theory of education is reframed in the Marxist way, which is, there's a special form of property, being educated, that is reserved by people who set the terms of it for themselves, blah, blah, blah. And thus retooled the entire point of education into the thought reform conscientization process. And that, in fact, is where we get that word of conscientization. It's from Paulo Freire. So that book should be, I think my typesetter is not available till the second week of August. So maybe late August, we'll be able to get that out. So you'll want to keep your eyes open for it. I'll be doing 2 workshops on the same subject coming up soon here at the end of July in the DC area, the last weekend. The flyer is on New Discourses now if you're interested in coming to DC at the last weekend of the month and listening to me talk about those education issues. And I'm going to do a repeat of that workshop at the end of September, the last couple of days of September up there in Idaho, but in Twin Falls, not in the Boise area. So we're already getting that rigged up with my Idaho people.
Good. You're popular in Idaho.
I am popular in Idaho. We're going to do it over in Twin Falls to kind of have the other side of the state for once, and also to make it more accessible to Utahns who might want to roll up from Salt Lake.
If you're in Salt Lake, take the 3-hour drive, maybe 2.5-hour drive up to Twin Falls, and tell me the dates again.
That will be, oh my gosh, it's literally the last 2 days of September, so the 29th and the 30th, okay. I think.
Good. Yeah, time well spent. What else?
Well, other than that, I mean, I'll be everywhere like usual. I've had actually I've had 2 long stays at home, but I'll be back on the road starting later this week. Speaking for Moms for Liberty, then for Turning Point, then for Young Americans for Freedom, or Young American Foundation, or whatever. I always get YAF wrong, and they always make fun of me. But going back on tour, I guess, but nothing specific, as I do. And trying to, tidy up the Marxification of education. Theology of Marxism book, I think I'll have laid out by the end of the year, for sure. So look forward to that publication. And the work, actually, if I were going to, if you want to deep dive in understanding the worldview behind this, the lecture series should be coming out within a couple of weeks on the Sovereign Nations channel. Sovereign Nations is the organization that hosted that 6 lecture series.
In Phoenix
that we did at the beginning of June, yeah. And we should have the videos. I just saw the guy who runs Sovereign Nations tweeted it the other day and said that he thinks it'll be within about 2 weeks. So we're going to start putting those videos out. And so 12 hours of lectures, plus we had some panels that we put together. Lots of deep dive into what is really going on to understand the kind of operating system of Marxism and how it's installed itself throughout our Western civilization and United States, system in specific. I would, if you really want to understand what's going on and have your eyes opened, you don't want to miss that.
Excellent. Well, James, I sure appreciate your time today. I think what you've shared is eye-opening for those who haven't been able to encounter an education about these things, and edifying for those who have begun to look into it, but who need to refine their thinking on these topics. And as always, I think you do great work. So thanks for taking the time to join us here today.
Appreciate it, Matt.